So this is our last lecture on chapter 16, and we're beginning to talk about the United States and the Pacific as it moves towards World War. So to refresh, what's going on in the Pacific here? Well, the pretty much leader of the Japanese on the military side is a guy by the name of Hideki Tojo, and he's the Japanese Army Chief of Staff. And he's the one that's been pushing for Japan to be able to use its, what he believes, superior army to be able to go and spread out in order to be able to grab more resources for its country in order to be able to turn it into an industrial power like the United States, Great Britain, Germany, or Russia. So in July of 1937, as we talked about, this marks the a major push for the Japanese, right, towards this aim of carving out its own living space, or in another way of taking looking at an Asia for the Asians, where the Japanese will become the uh, people who are dominating Asia instead of the Europeans. So it's July 1937, it launches a major invasion of China. It's going to attack major coastal cities, and it's going to control an area about the size of France in northeastern China around Beijing as it's fighting through China. July of 1941, uh, as we move towards there, the Europeans are begin to find themselves unable to defend their Asian possessions from falling into the Japanese hands. The French are no longer in existence because they've been taken over by Germany. The British are having to really hold on to what they have left in of trying to rescue their army out of the continent. And once they're trying to figure out what they can they hold on to with the rest of their empire as they begin to be picked apart from there. So the United States, as we talked about, is trying to help out as best they can. And so they respond by an order by President Roosevelt to freeze all the Japanese funds and assets in the United States. So what this order is asking for is that any Japanese person who has investments in the United States or owns something in the United States or has any money in there, it's going to be frozen. It's not stolen by the United States. It's just taken out of its account, put into kind of, again, you want to think of a vault and locked there as a way of saying, you can't touch this now unless you go and do that. Well, like a game of telephone, that's what Roosevelt wants. All he asked for is to be able to freeze these funds and assets. But as that message works its way through the government bureaucracy, somewhere along the line, right, it gets into a person's hands who reads it and says, well, like a game of telephone where you start off with saying, hey, freeze all Japanese funds and assets, it gets turned to stop all oil exports to Japan, purple monkey dinosaur, right? And so that's the problem that comes from there. So Japan now, who's been getting most of their oil to attack China from the United States and from other places owned to the Allies, now has no more oil and begins to really kind of freak out and take assessment of the situation here. Japan, as most industrial nations by this point, and its army and navy cannot function without oil. The Japanese high command sits down and does some calculations, says that they only have 2 years worth of oil reserves left in regular peacetime conditions, and they only have 18 months worth of oil left under war conditions to keep the planes, the tanks, the trucks, the ships all moving to help fight the Japanese war effort. And they're in a pretty uh, like dog eat dog fight in China to be able to go and do this. So it's getting pretty bad for them. So Japan says, as they sit down, they come up with two solutions to this problem of not having any more oil coming in from the United States. One, they can either solve the problem diplomatically, go to the United States, say, how can we solve this? And that's probably going to force them to either, at the very least, stop where their armies is right now, and most likely have to give up all the things that they've spent a lot of blood, treasure, and willpower on since 1937. The other option they think is that they can go down to the Dutch East Indies, like your Jakartas, your Javas, those areas there, and seize the oil fields from the Europeans there. However, they know that if they do that, not only will it solve their oil problem, but it will lead to war with the United States. And so, as Japan sees that a diplomatic option is no longer on the table, that they need to take these oil fields, they begin to say, well, it looks like war with the United States is almost becoming inevitable. You have to understand that both the United States and Japan do not want to fight each other. Japan wants to go and take and carve out and become the dominant power in the Pacific in Asia. So it wants to focus fighting on China. The United States wants to focus fighting in the Atlantic, fighting against Adolf Hitler. They don't want to go and fight against each other, but again, circumstances have kind of pulled them into this as they begin to move here. So that's Hideki Kojo, and again, he's kind of the head person as the government kind of shifts towards a military uh, kind of a force there, again, taking orders and leading the country. So by the time we get into 1941, right, you begin to see that Japan has taken over most of Manchuria, which they already have. They've taken over Korea. They've carved out an area from their invasion of Shanghai, and they've begun to march, taking Beijing, and begin to march their way into the big, huge, giant Chinese interior as they're moving through the country. Japan and the United States have set a December deadline for peace talks with the United States. So that's the deadline, December of 1941, that Japan is dealing with in order to be able to come to a agreement with the United States over this oil export ban that they've run into. It's in November that the Japanese say, well, this is it. We're going to prepare for war. And so the Japanese Navy begins to prepare to find some way of attacking on the United States. Now, the United States knows this is happening. The United States has broken Japanese diplomatic code and most of its military code. So they know they are planning an attack. But here's the big problem, and this is a important point that we really want to emphasize, is that just because the United States knows Japan's going to attack, they don't know where this attack is going to come. They don't know when the attack is going to happen. Well, it's one thing to say, oh, Mr. Cranmer is going to punch you in the face, but if you don't know where that's going to happen or when that's going to happen, you just know it's going to happen, then it's all sorts of issues that way. And so, again, this is kind of gets into the deal of, we'll talk about this more with like the 9/11 stuff, where, oh, the FBI and the CIA know for the months leading up that there's going to be a terrorist attack. But again, it's this idea of where or when is this attack going to come? And more importantly, is that the United States doesn't think that they're going to be attacked from this. So they know this attack's coming, so they begin to prepare for war with Japan. Now they've been doing this for a little while, just trying to take it a joint. So they send the their in their eyes their best military commander, their most famous general, and one of the most famous Americans in the United States in the 1940s. General Douglas MacArthur is sent to the United States in the Philippines. And what this is sending is saying, hey, look, we're sending our best military person right in the face of what you're doing to kind of try to deter the Japanese from there. You remember MacArthur? He was the person that was sent to clear out the bonus army in Washington, D.C. And in the 1930s, uh, we talked about Roosevelt describing MacArthur as one of the two most dangerous men in America, along with Huey Long. The next other thing that the United States has done to begin to prepare for Japan is that the U.S. Pacific Fleet, right, was sent to Pearl Harbor in Hawaii to act as another deterrent to the Japanese. Again, Hawaii, kind of you can think of it very close to halfway, right, between the United States and Japan. Don't quote me on that, but think of it that way. So again, you're moving the fleet that way to this. When they do that, a commander in Washington says this is the dumbest idea he's ever heard because it doesn't make any sense because all the U.S. war plans state that any attack in the Pacific, the U.S. fleet is to go back to its headquarters in San Diego, California. Anyway, so it's just wasteful to have the U.S. fleet in Pearl Harbor because any attack is going to trigger the fleet going to San Diego. So it doesn't make any sense. Just keep him in San Diego. He is promptly fired. The fleet is sent to Hawaii. So this is MacArthur, and he's going to be leading the defense in the Pacific from the Philippines. And he's pretty famous for the hat that he's got on and his corncob pipe. And MacArthur is excellent at public relations and becomes this kind of larger than life figure for the Americans in the Pacific theater of operations. And we'll see his name pop up again and again and again. So that young, dashing Douglas MacArthur, right, as he begins to begin his military career. So the United States is able to look at this coded message from the Japanese and be able to pick it apart and read it, what they're saying and what they're doing. So the United States knows that Japan is talking to their faces about peace, but behind their backs, the United States knows Japan is preparing for this attack. So do the Japanese decide? They decide to make an attack on Pearl Harbor in Hawaii on the U.S. Pacific Fleet. The Japanese fleet is going to make a gamble, and we have to really underline and underscore this point. This is a 100% risky gamble that they are betting on a massive surprise attack their goal is to destroy the U.S. fleet in the harbor in order to be able to cripple the United States' ability to carry the war in the Pacific. Japan knows that this is going to jumpstart and knows this attack will come. The goal is to be able to destroy the U.S. fleet so effectively and so completely that it will take them years to build up another force to be able to carry the attack into the Pacific. And in that time period, those years will be used by the Japanese to build up their defenses to create a Pacific wall, to create a defensive system with all these different islands that the United States would look at and shudder and say, well, we're just going to sue for peace. That's their plan. So the fleet leaves and it's sent on a very long, winding course. That this is the Pacific Ocean through the northern Pacific, right? It follows right behind a storm system to try to hide their radar and other things, and very strict radio silence. And they go pretty much totally unnoticed. When they're in the northern Pacific, then they sail straight south towards Hawaii in order to be able to stay out of usual shipping lanes or other stuff. And they go unnoticed as they begin their attack. We have to remember that an attack on Pearl Harbor is deemed extraordinarily low. The U.S. brass, the high command of the Army and Navy, is telling Roosevelt that, hey, yeah, put the fleet at Pearl Harbor. General George Marshall, the leading U.S. soldier in the United States military, tells Roosevelt Pearl is the strongest fortress of the world in that moment. So there's no way that anybody would even think of attacking them. Pearl Harbor is defended by a radar warning system in place. However, because everybody deems an attack on the United States so low, it only operates from 4 a.m. to 7 a.m. each day. Even with that small time on the day of the attack at at on December 7th, the radar operators don't even shut it down when they're supposed to. It's still on at 7:02 when the first wave of planes are detected at the Pearl Harbor radar station 137 miles out. And the operators look at each other and say, oh, these are the scheduled B-17 bombers we've been told about. They're on their way from San Diego. This is perfect. Shut it down. And they go about their Sunday there. So this is what Japan's trying to do here, their major plan. So they're trying to form a major wall that the United States will not be able to be penetrated because of their attack here on Pearl Harbor. So they sent their fleet on a long, winding path through the northern Pacific, away from usual shipping lanes, and then went south to be able to go and attack them that way. This is also a coordinated attack, not just on Pearl Harbor, but at the same time, and in the next couple of days, attacks on the Philippines and the Dutch East Indies as well to seize all of these oil fields and other resources that they need to carry out the war there. So this is Pearl Harbor. These are the next two pictures are going to show Pearl Harbor right before the attack. This is Pearl Harbor looking east, right, in October of 1941. So pretty close to what it's going to look like on the day of the attack. So you can see the airfields that are there, and you can see the harbor itself with you can even see some of the ships there from there. And so this is again looking from the opposite direction what an aerial view of Pearl Harbor is. You have all the battleships lined up on what's called Battleship Row. You have the other ships, so it's all right there, and again, defended by um, American pilots and other stuff. And this is what the Japanese are going to be seeing when they fly over the skies of Hawaii. So this is the plan of attack. You can kind of see from where they're flying from, and this is going to be led by Admiral Nagumo for the Japanese, and then also planned a little bit by Admiral Yamamoto to go and do this. So the attack on Pearl Harbor occurs, and you probably are aware of, Sunday, December 7th, 1941. At 7:40 a.m., four groups of 181 Japanese fighters, dive bombers, torpedo planes, and midget submarines arrive over the skies and in the harbor itself of Pearl Harbor. You have to remember that at this point in 1941, these Japanese pilots are flying the most modern aircraft. They're the most highly trained, deadly, and experienced pilots in the world. This is some of the same groups of fighters who bombed Shanghai in 1937, who have been fighting over the skies of China and have been racking up the kills and the experience and the flight hours over this. So they know exactly what they're doing and they can work quickly and effectively while they're over there. What do they find? For them, they find all the U.S. battleships lined up in the docks of the harbor like ducks in a row, laid out right for them. they find no U.S. fighter planes on alert. They find that the Army anti-aircraft guns have no live ammunition on hand. They have the dummy fake ammunition used for drills and other stuff. They catch the U.S. totally surprised, right, unable to do this. And so after the groups of planes go and fly, the two waves, what is the remark that's left is that they find the Japanese leave six battleships sunk and sinking. They leave two battleships, three destroyers, and three cruisers heavily damaged. They destroyed 180 planes and they left over 180 planes badly damaged. In terms of manpower, 3,600 sailors, airmen, army soldiers, and other people were killed or wounded on the attack. The aircraft carriers for the Japanese had a third wave ready to go, but they decided that after this point, let's hold off on that. Let's collect any of these straggling planes and let's leave because they figured that this was a complete and total success. And again, they're way far away from any sort of protection and they want to get back to Japanese home waters as quick as possible. That's what they do. The key takeaway, though, and this is important, you're going to put a star next to this, you're going to remember this, is that even how this seems successful, the Japanese, what's important is not is what's not destroyed at Pearl Harbor. The Japanese don't destroy any U.S. aircraft carriers. The aircraft carriers, which are going to become a major part of fighting in the Pacific in World War II, are out away from Pearl Harbor on training exercise at this point, so they are safe and so they are still able to help carry the war in the Pacific in the early months of 1942, nor did it destroy any of the huge oil reserves and logistical facilities of the harbor. And so, because of this, a lot of these ships are able to be repaired or be able to be scrapped and used for other stuff, and the harbor can be relatively turned back into a working harbor to help support the fleet as it's moving on from there. And so those two major mistakes of the Japanese of not destroying the aircraft carriers or the ability of the harbor to act as a repair or logistical station are going to be two key mistakes that are really going to be critical as we move into fighting this war and fighting this. Well, this is what the Japanese find in terms of a diagram. You have what's called Battleship Row, where the U.S. fleet, the battleships, the California, the Maryland, the Oklahoma, Tennessee, West Virginia, Arizona, right? The Nevada are right there. You have the cruisers and you have the smaller ships on there. But again, this is their main target, along with the aircraft carriers that again aren't going to be there because they're off training. And so the Japanese have planned for this for a long time. The Japanese back in Japan made a scale model of the harbor, right? Because they're able to take pictures and other stuff and gather other information from spies in Hawaii. And they're able to get, again, to this to a point where Japanese pilots could go and see and mock out and walk out their runs. They'd be able to see this down to the trees planted on the model itself as they begin to prepare for this. And again, this is very highly scripted. This is highly organized in the attack that they're doing. The Japanese there in the North Pacific go and on the aircraft carrier begin to load up their planes. The pilots get the last minute instructions. They get their orders. They type in the planes and then they're off. So this is one of the caps and goggles and stuff that one of the pilots was wearing when he took off for the attack on Pearl Harbor. What do the Japanese find is they find, like this picture from this actual picture from the Japanese planes here, you can see some of the other ones. This is what they find there. All of the ships lined up like ducks in a row, nobody really on hand, and they're able to take abandon as very few any resistance is really put up by the United States because of how complete and totally caught by surprise they were. So they start dropping bombs, strafing, and killing stuff from there. On top of that, they have small couple man submersibles that are also in the harbor as well, who are launching torpedoes to help cause even more havoc in there. And so you can see from this December 7th, 1941, air raid on Pearl Harbor is sent out, right, to the high command back in Washington. Again, this is not a drill. Begin to figure out that this is problems from there. And again, what the Japanese leave? Destruction, explosions, and all sorts of problems as they begin to drop bombs and destroy stuff all over the place. So again, it's not just the battleships, but they're also destroying. You can see the airplanes, all right, and the hangars and the ability to repair those right there. You can see that again, the United States did eventually start tuning up. Those are those black puffs of smoke are all anti-aircraft fire. So again, they're trying to do that and trying to level from there. This is the USS Arizona. It was hit directly, kind of in its arsenal, and it was said that the explosion was so great that the big, two giant modern USS Arizona was lifted completely out of the water before settling back down in there. And so this is a pretty famous. You have the USS Arizona Memorial in Pearl Harbor today, and again for weeks soldiers or sailors, sorry, were found trapped underneath the water line. So they still had oxygen underneath there, but they couldn't get to them. And divers would hear tapping on the side, the hole with the sailors inside trying to get them. But after a while, the tapping eventually wore out as those guys ran out of oxygen or drowned or uh, died in other different ways. So the Arizona really is a graveyard along with other stuff. You can see a little bit of color picture of just how devastating the attack is. So not only the battleships attacked, but you can see hangars and aircraft were also targeted by the Japanese as the Americans were trying to protect that. And again, this is an island that people lived on. It's not just the soldiers there, but they have wives. The officers have families, and so they're kind of caught in this as well along with the high school here on Oahu. It was also hit and destroyed, and kind of the aftermaths are all flying all around from there. So, what do we start to pull out? You have a Japanese pilot there who was shot down, all right, and pulled out of the water. And then again, as they're leaving, this is what they find. That's all black oil that's leaking out of these ships as they're sunk and they kind of settle down to the bottom of the harbor. And again, those big pool stuff, which is called dangerous. The important thing to remember, again, they don't destroy all the big giant vats of oil, and they don't destroy the ability, like we see in this picture, of the USA being able to go and pick these kind of ships up, take them in there, salvage what they can, or maybe even try to flip something over to try to pick things up. So with the attack in Washington itself, the mood ranges from outrage to total panic. It's the next day, December 8th, that Roosevelt calls the attack, which we'll see in a speech here in a second, a day which will live in infamy. And he asks for and receives from Congress a declaration of war against Japan. 3 days later, to honor the Tripartite Pact, Germany and Italy declare war on the United States. If we take a step back and look at this from a modern day perspective, this is stupid. This is ridiculously stupid in both for both to do this. It doesn't make any sense. The United States really isn't hurting Germany and their warfare there. All this does is give Roosevelt the ability to send the United States into the European Atlantic theater of operations. And again, that's going to lead towards the downfall for this. So when Mussolini and Hitler signed this, they're basically, from our point of view, in hindsight, their own death warrants, right, by doing this. It makes no sense for them to do it. But again, they're honoring the tripartite pact. With the attack on Pearl Harbor, many of the staunch isolationists in Congress, in the United States itself, now support an all American war effort to get revenge for Pearl Harbor. And there's stories, again, if you watch any World War II documentary or or read anything about that, this is a very seminal event for a lot of different people, right? We have people dropping what they're doing and going signing up. I've done enough projects talking to my grandma, right? And both grandmas very vividly remember what they were doing when they're this. So this is one of those like touchstone moments in U.S. history where everybody kind of remembers where they heard about this news, whether they're playing with paper dolls like my grandma was, or whether they were at the barber shop or listening to this. Everybody remembered this, just like how people remember when JFK was shot or when the 9/11, what they were doing during 9/11, or even like when the country was shut down here with the coronavirus. See massive wave of volunteers for the armed forces. And again, the attack on Pearl Harbor is just one small part of a major Japanese attack throughout the Pacific. They attack Wake Island and Guam, American possessions, a few hours after Pearl Harbor, capitalizing on American confusion. And with this, Japan now controls the entire communications line of the Central Pacific. They've isolated the U.S. held and controlled Philippines from the rest of it. And as you probably can guess, the next place the Japanese are going to attack are going to be the Philippines. So lots of people again are going to be going out there, and again you can see in all these pictures, extra, extra. Japan is attacked. They're going from there. People are reading all about it, right? And so from that way. In the consulate for the Japanese in New Orleans, the government for the Japanese in the United States is burning a whole heck of a lot of documents, right? They help again protect that, keep their secrets. And again, like you see in other major events, is that people went and just kind of congregated together here in front of the White House as December 7th and December 8th kind of try to get some sort of some reassurance or talk to people to figure out what this is. The famous speech that Roosevelt gives is his Day Which Will Live in Infamy speech, where he goes right, and we're going to listen to a selection of it here in a second.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. The United States was at peace with that nation, and at solicitation of Japan, still in conversation with its government and its emperor, looking toward the maintenance of peace in the Pacific. Indeed, 1 hour after Japanese air squadrons had commenced bombing in the American island of Oahu, the Japanese ambassador to the United States and his colleague delivered to our Secretary of State a formal reply to a recent American message. And while this reply stated that it seemed useless to continue the existing diplomatic negotiations, it contained no threat.
So, following the attack on Pearl Harbor, Churchill is going to come to stay with Roosevelt in the White House as December 1941 turns into January of 1942. And they're going to kind of begin to bandy about some ideas of what's going to happen next. And here's where we're going to kind of leave the story as Roosevelt is flipping on the Christmas tree lights for the White House with Churchill standing to his right. And we're going to leave the story here and we'll pick up with this in our next chapter as America now officially enters World War II.